Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today on Venture Studios. I'm Jaimie Testai of Osage University Partners, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Next slide. And I just want to thank our amazing panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules today to join us to share their venture studios and then also to share their expertise in this space. They can do a much better job at introducing themselves than I can. So I'm going to have Tyler, if you could start with your introduction, please.
Certainly. Jaimie, thanks so much for putting this together. I'm Taylor Bench. I am with Summit Venture Studio. And just by way of background, I've spent about half of my career outside of the university tech transfer area. So engineer by education, and then went into finance and the fund management and investment banking. And then I spent about a decade inside the tech transfer office at the University of Utah, running the new ventures and kind of internal fund there. All of our startup portfolio. And over the last 4 years, I left University of Utah and started Summit Venture Studio with my partner, Spencer, who was at the university with me, and raised a small fund focused on launching, creating, co-founding, and investing in university startups.
Great. Tom, if you can introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jaimie. Tom Denison. I'm CEO and co-founder of SmartHealth Catalyzer. Of course, we are a venture studio, but a little bit of background on myself. I sort of grew up in the tech startup world, going way, way back to the 90s, thus all the gray hair, but was modestly fortunate to be a part of 3 exits and ended up mentoring and advising hundreds of early stage founders from concept all the way through to exit and everything in between. But it was about a dozen years ago that I just encountered a huge problem, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that I couldn't help but try and solve. And so launched SmartHealth Catalyzer almost exactly 5 years ago. Basically, we build startups around promising biomedical innovations coming out of the Midwest here in the US. And I currently have a half a dozen companies in our portfolio and looking to add a couple more by the end of the year.
Okay. And now Prutha.
Hi, everyone. Jaimie, thank you for bringing us all together. Taylor, Tom, great to join you at this panel here today. Like Taylor, I'm an engineer by training, but went over to the dark side pretty early on. Worked in investment banking for 3.5 years. But I'm absolutely in love with this 0 to 1 venture building phase. And I've explored this now through my roles as a startup incubation manager, as a 2-time startup founder. And finally, as a venture, as an associate at a venture capital fund, and now in my role as an innovation manager at Rose Rock Bridge. In this very exciting role, I get to work with academic researchers and with corporate innovation teams of Fortune 500 companies, trying to build really exciting energy technologies and bringing them into the market with investor off-takers. Looking forward to learning more about, venture studios from Taylor and Tom here, and sharing some perspective and work that we are doing at Rose Rock Bridge. Thank you so much.
And once again, thank you all for participating today. So next slide. I'm just going to go over a few logistics before we get into the webinar today. So the webinar today is first presentation and then discussion, but please ask any questions throughout the webinar. There's the Q&A function in Zoom. Please put your questions in there, not in the chat function. We monitor the Q&A function. Additionally, a recording of this webinar will be available on OUP's partner portal, and a recording will also be publicly available via our YouTube channel. The partner portal is an online resource for the tech transfer officers and researchers at our partner institutions that is full of relevant tech transfer and startup content. Once you are in the portal, which you will need to register if you have not already, you'll find a downloadable presentation deck and video link for this webinar on the webinars page, which is under the startup resource section. And you can find these resources also via those QR codes on this slide. Next slide. And for those of you who just aren't familiar with OUP, a quick short intro. We're a venture fund that partners with academic institutions to invest in their startups, typically by exercising the participation rights available through their licenses. Participation rights are the ability to invest in a future rounds of of a startup as it raises money. And if you have any questions on participation rights, including the standard language for these rights, please reach out. As part of our partnership with academic institutions, the institutions also share in our profits and receive various support on tech transfer best practices in academic startups. OUP is now on its fourth fund and has made investments in over 150 companies in all areas of deep science, with many of those companies exiting either through IPO or M&A. And we're always happy to talk with anyone more about our model, so feel free to reach out. Some contact information will be available at the end of this presentation. So next slide. And on that note, today we're going to go through first some presentations, or our panelists are going to present their Venture Studio models. We're going to start with Summit Venture Studio. And just a reminder, please ask questions throughout the webinar and put it in that Q&A feature. So next we'll go over to Summit Venture Studio.
Awesome. Thanks, Jaimie. I went through a bit of my background. So Summit, I left the University of Utah in January of 2020, having had a few $1 million soft circled for our fund. And then, as everybody knows, that was a rough time to start a company. So it took about a year and a half to close our fund, but we closed the fund in December of 22. I'll give a little bit of context. You can go to the next slide. This is the problem that I imagine everyone on the call understands and feels every day, is that there is so much funding going into universities with a proportionally tiny amount of follow-on investment into the companies or into the projects that are spinning out of universities. You can go to the next slide. This next image is a funnel that we've built to illustrate the different stages generally of what a tech transfer office goes through. This is kind of how we looked at it at the University of Utah when I was there. So the top part of the funnel there, those different stages are generalized of what the life cycle of a technology looks like, going from research to revenue and scale. The bottom numbers there are coming out of Autumn report, showing generally the ratios or the size or number of projects in each one of those stages. Summit Venture Studio, we work from that very earliest stage, even in the grant side of things, where we're helping identify potential grant awardees that have commercialization potential. And then we run through until kind of that revenue, the end of the revenue stage. We're standing up these companies, going from 0 to 1, getting first revenue. You can go to the next slide. So that challenge in that funnel, the solution that we propose and that we've created is basically adding a venture studio in the middle of that funnel and adding that to the university commercialization process that all of you are running in your institutions. Next slide. So what is a venture studio? They come in as many flavors as there are ice cream, which I love ice cream and I love to see different flavors of studios. Oftentimes they are founder-focused studios where they're looking for a team that has identified a project that they want to take through that 0 to 1 and scaling life cycle. We're a little bit different than that in that we're looking for those ideas inside universities. So we're actually taking on that role up at the top on the founder side of the founder circle, but we're also providing all of those other circles that come into that venture studio center circle there. So we're the initial founders, we're a fund, we have a back office or a startup stack as we call it, that's kind of listed out over on the left like an accelerator would, and then we're also creating that startup entity. So we have those shared resources, about 20-25 people on our team that take care of all of the headaches that a typical entrepreneur, single solopreneur has to deal with when starting a company. Next slide. So the way that we execute, it's kind of in 3 stages. So up along the top, you can see the discover, develop, and deploy. And then at the bottom, the cultivate, curate, and commercialize. We love alliterations, and that makes us think that we're really good at marketing. So on that discover side, that's that funnel that I was showing earlier. We have those stage gates inside our process that we go through and do the deal mining or disclosure mining with the tech transfer offices. But then we've built some tools and processes to do our due diligence to get us to an option or a license. There's a validate in that funnel for us where we're running an internal program very similar to iCore. So we may option a technology, run it through our internal iCore 8-week process to help do our due diligence. And the develop, we're taking on that role. That's when we license something, is to get into the develop. We're taking on the roles of market development, technical, product, basically everything. As the original founder, we'll recruit a co-founding president to help us do that, get to first sales, and then the plan is to exit fairly quickly comparative to other companies. Next slide. These are the different industries that we have started companies in so far. So we've launched 15 companies in the last couple of years. Ideally, these are industries and kind of areas where you're seeing a lot of disclosures as well. Next slide. Structure-wise, as I mentioned, SVS takes on a lot of those initial roles of investment and management team. What we're looking for the university to is to provide the license, potentially gap funds if they have a gap fund program, and generally the network of the university that could be beneficial. And then we have an option pool for both the co-founding president as well as the inventors. We really like to engage the inventors as much as possible in the company at whatever level they want to. We can go to the next slide. So why a venture studio? You may have seen these data and this report that some awesome, smart people in the venture studio world created. The ones that we like to highlight are that IRR compared to typical VC startups, as well as the time that the typical VC versus the studio create that IRR. So the economics, speed, and execution are critical for us. Next slide. This is just a quick reference of the shared services that we provide. One of the things that I did want to also share, and I'll do this in the chat, that link at the bottom is just a Google folder where we create or have put together a lot of template documents to share with our tech transfer partners. So there's due diligence checklists, financial models, etc. If you go to that and then just request access, I'll get that to you as soon as I can. Next slide. So the exit part for us, I'll just touch quickly on that. What we see mostly coming out of universities, especially in the software space where we focus, are products rather than platforms for billion-dollar companies. So we're creating bolt-on acquisitions or tuck-in acquisitions for established companies most of the time, probably 80% of the time. So with that, we are partnering with those corporate partners from the very beginning to say, what are problems that you need solved? We'll look inside the university portfolios that we work with to pull out and draw out what the market really wants. And then we'll get it to a point where we've got initial product market fit. And that's where we start looking out and saying, okay, what established company should acquire this as a new product in their lineup? Next slide.
Really,
in terms of a case,
Tyler, just to interrupt for a second. So we had some questions come in. So first, do you invest in companies based in Utah?
We do invest in Utah, but we do it throughout the US. So right now we're working with about 90 universities. I think the last two options that we signed, one was with Rutgers and another one with MUSC. So really across the country. We're a virtual first studio, so we're pretty flexible.
And then you mentioned gap funding. So do you commit gap funding as well, or are you relying solely on the universities for this?
Well, so we raised our fund, small fund, about $10 million. And what we do is we're the first investor in the companies, but we also like to make sure that all of the equity holders in the companies are aligned and incentivized the same. So if there are gap funding programs in the university, we love to partner with them and say, yeah, you can co-invest with us. But typically we're putting 100 to maybe up to 500K into these companies to get them from that 0 to 1. I think I answered that question.
Yeah, so the gap funding you're working with mostly is those universities that have investment funds. Okay.
Correct. Or any type of program that kind of like what Jacob Johnson is doing with his COA group and other funds where universities may have programs that can invest in their startups.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for answering those questions.
Yeah. I think this is the last case study or the last slide I had. I'll quickly go through the case study here where we worked with the Houston Methodist Hospital Tech Transfer Office. Dr. Brian Parrish got a $1 million basically grant. It was a donation to create some software to help identify medication errors in the hospital. So he developed in-house software. Well, he and a team developed this software to tap into Epic, monitor the health records of the patients while they're in the hospital, and as their status changes, identify where medication errors or drug interactions would be detrimental. So we licensed that IP. There was a patent. This is one of the 2 companies that there is a patent pending on the software, but most of the time we're licensing copyright and know-how, but this one is a bit of an anomaly in that sense. And as we have spun that out of the university or out of the hospital, they're actually going to be the first paying customer as well. So we're a week or so away from signing that first initial customer contract. So that university has worked with us really closely, and their different departments are really jumping in and being great partners and co-founders with us.
Great. Tyler, another question, sorry. Let's talk a little bit about the money. I think that's what people always want to know about. So do universities have to pay at all to participate in the studio? And then also on the reverse, how does the money work? Like where do you get your money from? How does the money go to the company? And then also how does the university get any financial benefit potentially?
Yeah. No, we do not charge the universities, but that is a great business model that I'm going to start pursuing. No, we're basically a licensee. So we identify a technology that we like. We'll take it through our initial due diligence, and we may option the technology so that we can take it through our internal I-Core-like process, as a typical optionee or licensee would. And then when we convert that option into a license, we create a new C Corp for that license. Initially it's a wholly owned C Corp of our fund. And then when we license the tech in, the university will, in the license, get a portion of the equity in the companies. On average, we've tried to keep it within typical Autumn or LES bounds of university getting 5 to 10% of the equity, with some typical non-dilute clauses in there. Almost all of our licenses, maybe all but one, do not have royalties in them. It's an all equity play in the software space, so it's kind of patterned after the software licenses that you've seen some universities doing, the simple software license. money flows from the fund to that startup when we invest in that, and basically we're the co-founders, we're recruiting that management team, incentivizing them with equity and some cash.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I hope I got all of those answers to all those questions.
If not, the audience will let us know. So
Awesome. So that's all. Would love to work with any of the universities on. We are our goal is to launch 5 new companies by the end of the year. We've got 3 or 4 in the pipeline right now, but we move pretty quickly on that front end. So yeah, thank you very much, and happy to answer any other questions.
perfect. And I think now we're going to move on to Tom.
All right. First of all, Taylor, I am so glad you went first. You did an amazing job of explaining Adventure Studio and covering many things that are not in my deck, but I appreciate that. So let's go to the next slide, but I want to share a bit of a backstory, and hopefully this will resonate with folks joining us here today. And this was a very serendipitous kind of experience, but it was one that was personal to me, and I will sort of explain. So about a dozen years ago, I was meeting with a small medical school here in Chicago for different reasons altogether, not about venture studios and so on, but the conversation pivoted pretty quickly. I was chatting with the president and the head of research there, and they were just starting to contemplate what I would call bio-entrepreneurship. So spin out startups, venture capital, entrepreneurship, and so on. But they admittedly had no idea what they were doing. So given my background and my experience working with hundreds of startups and being a part of a handful of startups, they asked for my help. So I said, sure. And so what ended up happening is I met with, I think 7 or 8 of their PIs, their scientists. And there was one woman in particular that really blew me away on what she was working on. And by the way, I'm not a scientist. I don't have a PhD in anything, just a lot of experience in the startup world. But even being a non-scientist, I could see that there was something very promising there. But here's the thing. You battle your way through an 87-slide, extremely academic presentation with charts and graphs and things that even to this day, I have no idea what they mean. And what occurred to me was that there was no way that this amazing research would ever escape the 4 walls of this PI's lab without some sort of help. And that just really bothered me. So, and oh, by the way, the reason why this is personal is because my dad happens to be one of those PIs, those professors. He's, give you an idea, he's 85 years old. He's now in his 57th year of teaching and publishing and researching and getting grants and all of that. He is the purest of pure academics. So I absolutely could relate to the challenges that this PI had at this small medical school. But then I thought, well, this can't be unique. So I widened out to University of Chicago, Northwestern, University of Illinois, where I went, and I met with dozens and dozens of scientists and confirmed. We know there are absolutely brilliant scientists, professors, PIs at universities and research hospitals coming up with amazing biomedical innovations. But the reality is this, the vast majority of them just do not have the experience, the tools, the expertise needed to successfully spin something out of their institution. And of course, there are notable exceptions here and there, but again, it's the vast majority that just do not have the experience. And for me, just thinking about all of those research dollars and all of those potential new therapeutics, diagnostics, med tech, biotech that will never, ever reach patients in need, just again, really, really bothered me. So I just became hell-bent on solving for that. And Taylor actually touched upon this in his presentation as well, is that particularly in the Midwest, and I'm a Midwest kid to the bone, grew up in Ohio, went to University of Illinois, live in Chicago. There is a huge disconnect between the quality and quantity of research being done in the Midwest and follow-on venture capital going to biomedical spinouts. So these two numbers, 30 and 6, the Midwest represents about 30% of all NIH grant funding, which I think a couple years ago, that was well over $8 billion. Yet, in the venture capital world, going to biomedical spinouts, the Midwest gets less than 6% of venture capital. So Taylor pointed out the same sort of problem. This is what I would think to be a huge problem here in the Midwest. And of course, we know where most of the venture capital goes in biomedical spinouts, to the coasts, to Boston, San Francisco, San Diego, and so on. So again, I just became hell-bent on solving for this. Next slide. So what we thought is, what if we took or built out a huge, deep bench of experts and folks that have been there and done it before in the biomedical startup world, and simply combine them with the best and most promising biomedical discoveries coming out of the Midwest. Next slide. So what we got to is developing a very, very efficient process that would help us in this process. So we basically start with not necessarily the what, but the who. So when you think about University of Michigan or Northwestern or Wisconsin or Ohio State or WashU or what have you, what we think about first is who are the most prolific innovators at those institutions, who are the rising stars, who are getting the most grant funding, who are prolific innovators, and get to know those folks. And once we get to know the who, then we start thinking about the what. What is it that they're working on? What is it that has the most promise? What is it that is solving for the biggest unmet needs? And so what we've done on top of this is that we put together a huge team of experts that will then go through a due diligence process taking several weeks. And if we get to a point where we believe there is something promising, then we look to you all to start sort of the licensing process, and in parallel start to build the right team for that particular opportunity, and then seed fund it, and then off to the races. And again, similar to Taylor, this becomes a very, very efficient model where we're moving startups from inception to exit as quickly and efficiently as possible, bridging the proverbial valley of death. Next slide. So I touched upon this earlier, but we've put together a very, very large team of folks who call them the ops team, as in operators or operations. Right now, we've got well over 150 people on our team, and these are folks with decades of experience and expertise each across all things biomedical, whether it's IP, regulatory, preclinical, commercial, manufacturing, whether it's therapeutic, diagnostic, med tech, biotech, you name it, we have that expertise. And so out of this pool of people, these are folks that are at the ready for due diligence, but also venture creation, meaning these are the folks we will tap into to eventually run our startup companies. By the way, I didn't mention this before, that it is critical to us that the inventor, the PI, stay as engaged as possible, but traditionally do not have an operational role. So typically they would be kept on as a chief scientific advisor. Of course, they would have substantial equity in the company, and if all goes well, they would be handsomely rewarded. Next slide. So today we're working with about 50 Midwest universities and research hospitals. You all, I hope there are some here on the call today. I'm sure there are. Most are universities, but we do work with Mayo, Cleveland Clinic, and Cincinnati Children's in Ohio, which, by the way, is the #1 children's hospital in the world. Next slide.
And just really quick, Tom.
Yeah.
So we had a few questions come in.
Mhm.
I think there was some questions of, you had mentioned that you really like to work with the top researchers in the field. So first question is there any particular interest areas that you currently have? Is there any certain disease areas, or is it more agnostic and then it depends on the PI?
Yeah, we are definitely agnostic. So it's really, I hesitate to use this word, but sort of opportunistic. And it really comes down to the problem that's being solved. And if there is, a regulatory pathway, if there is a real commercial opportunity, and also thinking about the exit opportunities as well. I do want to mention one other thing is that historically we have started with the who and then think about the what. But a couple of years ago, we started up something called Best of the Bio Midwest. And this is a competition. We just had our second annual Best of the Bio Midwest in June. But basically, it was an open call to any PI at any one of these institutions that believes they're working on a promising new therapeutic or med tech. And so this was open to all, and basically have an online application, and then that goes to offline due diligence. And then we arrive at a top 10, leveraging all the experts that we have. And then those top 10 participate in a fun, interactive, engaging pitch event here in Chicago, but also have an opportunity to meet with 10 VCs in person, one-on-one. So to give you an idea, in June, we had Deerfield, we had Estella's, we had Lilly, and a number of other notable VCs. So really trying to be that, not only a venture studio looking for opportunities to build new companies, but to be that connector or connective tissue, if you will, between the universities, the PIs, and venture capital, and of course, hosting it here in our great city of Chicago.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So also you mentioned that you're trying to find these amazing researchers at these institutions. So how do you find those researchers? And then how do you work with the tech transfer offices?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's some science behind finding great researchers and some not. So, and a lot of times we rely upon tech transfer. So it's easy to find out who are getting the big grants. That's great. That's a data point. But we also sort of rely upon folks at the universities to let us know, who do we need to be talking to? Who do you believe are the most prolific innovators? And there could be, shooting stars that are coming, youngsters that are building up a portfolio of innovations that maybe haven't fully registered yet in huge grants and all of that, but are folks that we should talk to. So there's a little bit of research that goes into it, but also a little bit of who, do you believe? And I mean tech transfer and maybe heads of innovation, at various institutions, who do they believe are the folks that we need to be meeting with?
Mm-hmm. And would you ever consider working with a university that's not in the Midwest?
No.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank
Sorry.
you.
That's our mandate.
No, that's okay. And then once again, sort of one of the questions we talked about before, the money. How does the money work? How do you put money into the company?
Yep.
And what do you get in return?
So we are a little bit different than Taylor in that we do not have our own fund, although I should say we do, but it's a small, very small fund. So what we do is this, and what we have done successfully is, one, we will put in $50K to get started. And that's basically just, to build a company and such, and then work with tech transfer in any way that makes sense. I hate to keep leaning on Taylor, but I will. He did a fine job of explaining, how I think all of us end up working with tech transfer is it's about negotiating, negotiating milestones, negotiating what equity, the university has up front, and so on and so forth. I think, we're sort of getting to a point where I wouldn't say there's a template that all universities are using, but we're getting pretty doggone close to that. So we have certain expectations, or we know, I guess, what universities are expecting generally. And we will pay for license fees and so on. And then how the money flows from there is that we have built up a consortium of venture capital firms. So we have well over 200 VCs that we work with. And so at inception, we will have venture capital at the ready. So again, unlike Taylor, we do not have our own venture fund, but we are part of the process. I think about it in this way. It's sort of analogous to my time in the tech startup world, where classically a startup would be a hacker and a hustler. The programmer and the biz dev person. And so in this situation, the hacker is the scientist, the PI, the innovator. And we collectively, SmartHealth, we are the hustler. We put the right team in place. We go out and raise the capital. And I can give you a very real world example. So I don't know if University of Illinois is on the call here today, but we actually have 2 spin outs from University of Illinois. Not by design. I know I went there. It's just a coincidence. But anyway, they're a great PI there, Dr. Katzenellenbogen. We spun a company out from there, and then successfully raised seed funding of $2.2 million shortly after inception. And I'm sure folks know on the call here in the biomedical world, that's a fairly average seed funding round. I know it might seem like a lot, but that's just reality. And then on top of that, they're just now getting a grant. So again, we are hustling to raise capital in any which way possible. And of course, we love non-dilutive funding. So there's another one of our startups spun out of Michigan where we have yet to get venture capital, but we have a $2.2 million grant that is getting us to pre-IND. So that's pretty awesome. Again, non-dilutive funding, which bodes well for the university and the founders and SmartHealth.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think we're going on to next slide. So I think now it's Prutha.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. Taylor and Tom have simplified my job, so I'm going to keep it short and simple. But Taylor said the context really well. He said the different flavors of venture studios, and Rose Rock Bridge definitely is different from the 2 that you just heard about. We are the early stage innovation and investment engine for some of the largest energy companies in the US. The job that we do at Rose Rock Bridge is to source the right set of opportunities. We commercialize them with all these energy companies involved in the process. And the goal is to basically conclude the life cycle of that startup with some integration into these larger energy companies, right? If you can go to the next slide, please. So like I was saying, our process, it actually begins and concludes with Fortune 500 partners that we have. So currently within Energy Partners, we have Devon Energy, which is a large upstream oil and gas company. We have Bannock and Williams, which are midstream companies and control more than 1/3 of the natural gas across the US. We have Helmerich and Payne, one of the largest geothermal investors out there. And very recently, we added Microsoft to our collision of partners, strengthening it further, right? So what do we do with these partners, right? The biggest and the longest process that we do for every cohort of startups that we bring in is that we identify white space opportunity areas with our partners. Just to give you an example, Devon and H&P, for instance, they have a lot of experience in drilling oil and gas wells and horizontal drilling, right? Now, this expertise is required for everything which is happening in next-gen geothermal. Now, what are those technologies which are going to make next-gen geothermal really successful? And by the way, we have about, really about $300 million worth of investments in geothermal companies like Fervo, Evor, Greenfire. So we really know what's happening on the field for these companies, right? So we spent about 4 months trying to develop our thesis on, hey, maybe we need downhole sensing tools which can survive at great pressures and great temperatures. We require better exploration technologies to know exactly where to drill for a geothermal resource. Now, once we zero down on these innovation priority areas with our partners, we go ahead and we have a sourcing mechanism with tech transfer offices across the country, some labs like NREL, and we also work with some some universities in Canada which bring in a lot of good deal flow for us. What we are trying to look for in these universities is is your technology a fit for the innovation areas or priorities that we have identified for our partners? Second is, we love to see some kind of grant funding already associated with that technology, because we're not interested in just an idea at this point. We want to look at some bench scale prototype and an identified use case. Last but not the least, something that Tom mentioned was that it's very rare for the inventors to actually be involved operationally in these companies. So we really like to see a team of postgrad or graduate students around the PI who can take it forward, as and when we commercialize this technology. So we have a very people, projects, potential lens of due diligencing the deal flow that we get from various universities and labs. We also look at early stage founders. We don't have to just look at PIs. But the stage at which we engage with these PIs or startups is typically between a TRL3 to TRL5, right? And once we find them, the idea is that we bring them into the loop, we bring them to the venture studio for a duration of 12 months. Now, what do we do in this 12 months? Well, we give them non-dilutive funding upfront, right? This is $100,000 of free zero equity cash component, but we top it up with $50,000 of non-cash components, which include something like, hey, you need an option or a license from your tech transfer office, let us help you figure it out. You want to expand your IP portfolio, we have legal firms which will help you with that. You want to go after an ARPA open, we have grant writers who can prepare that proposal for you. You just focus on developing your technology. So there's a suite of business support services, but what we do really well and why we actually get to commercial outcomes by the end of 12 months is that we provide commercial workflows from our corporate partners to these inventors or these technologists, right? So we know what the technology is that they're working on. We connect them with operational engineers with our partner firms, and we are able to give practical constructs for how the product should be developed, right? Let's talk about tough technologies like converting methane into green fuel, right? Potentially, a lab infrastructure at universities cannot accommodate for the size of reformer engines that a solution like this requires. But we have those assets in the field in Oklahoma or Texas, where we can potentially tell you exactly what is going to work and what is not. So we have asymmetric insight to provide into what technology is going to make a difference or what is going to be a step change improvement or what we are seeing in the market. The idea within this 12 months with this commercial workflows and the level of support I'm talking about is that, hey, 3 things can happen. And 3 things do happen for most of our startups is A, we do a pilot test on active real assets of our partners. And these are large assets, right? We're talking 70,000 miles worth of pipeline across the United States. We're talking about, an extensive portfolio of oil and gas wells in the Permian Basin, right? So we can really test out these technologies to a grand scale. Second is that if the pilot test is successful, we have an in-house $50 million venture fund, which is called EIC Rose Rock, which can come in and do that pre-series, pre-seed to a pre-series A kind of an investment. Third, and which is the most critical, is that if the pilots are successful, we have made sure that there's a landing place for your technology with our partners. So there's a potential for a customer contract at the end of, that 12-month kind of a cycle. So if you can go to the next slide. So this is just to kind of, put all the things that I've said into perspective when it comes to a focus area that we are very passionate about, which is next-gen geothermal. So we started with this focus area. We created the value chain map that you see in front of you. That's our understanding of how the market works. And those red areas are the places where we really need innovation and technologies to come through. So we actually evaluated 270 technologies in the market to arrive at, hey, these are still white space areas, and let's try and find patents or early stage technologies that we can develop to address these gaps. The 4 startups that you see at the bottom are the ones that we identified, and we have been engaging with all 4 of them for about just 6 months, but all of them have a regular cadence with the corporate innovation investment teams and operational engineers of our partners, and are well on their way of creating pilot programs. In fact, in the boardroom next to me, we are having a update discussion with all our corporate partners about the roadblocks for these companies and what needs to be done next. So this level of engagement, we are able to convert into very tangible, real commercial outcomes for these companies. I also want to add here that the Venture Studio is set up as a 501 nonprofit. So for those 12 months, we are charging no equity, but they're still getting money, pilot, and direct customer discovery and feedback. After the pilots are successful, we have a for-profit venture fund in-house. We also have these extremely large, as you can imagine, corporate venture arms, which can go ahead and make direct investments. And also, venture funding is very interesting, right? Once there's a customer on board, once there is a pilot and a tech assess done by one of the largest players in the market, it really opens up avenues for the ways that you can raise capital. And we have, not just for these 4 startups, but we have replicated these commercial outcomes for about 19 companies, which is the next slide, if we can skip to it. As you can see, there are a few stats. I won't go into them, but they're really impressive and they've been achieved in a very short duration of time. But this slide also gives you a gist of, where are the universities from which these companies are coming from, and we interact with these universities in various ways. We work less with tech transfer offices and directly with the PIs more. We also have, a consortium of entrepreneurs in residence who can fill in those CXO level gaps and work with the PIs as we are building towards a pilot or a customer contract or a venture investment. So it's a very bespoke support that comes really from the industry. But of course, we work with our legal teams and the tech transfer offices to make sure that the IP is secure and the PI has all the rights associated with it, because licensing as a business model is not something that we deal with at our level or even with our industry partners. We love our equity investments, but we'll only do them when we know that the technology really works. We are working on a lot more exciting things. Geothermal was our last cohort. If we can skip to the next slide, we are looking at more strategic areas of interest. Some of the areas of interest which have always been with us, and we have many startups that we are working on, are critical minerals, methane management, produced water. But one which is really on the top of our minds right now, because we added Microsoft to our fold of partners, is decarbonizing data centers. As you know, AI is growing. With AI, there's a need for grid expansion. We want to put 500 terawatt hours more of electricity on the grid, hopefully from clean electrons. And that is going to require low carbon power. It might take geothermal and nuclear slightly a longer duration than that to be scalable, but there are solutions like long duration energy storage and carbon capture and sequestration that we can use to decarbonize natural gas to meet the data center demand. So that's an area of interest. We have started, inviting startups to enter our due diligence process, which is very venture style and takes kind of a longer turnaround time because we want to hit the mark with the relevant technologies that we want to work with. But we are open for, learning more from tech transfer offices. I would love to, chat with a few of you if, inventors which are working in the space. But yeah, excited for our next cohort. Remember, the tangible outcomes that we really love and like is working towards pilot investments and a customer contract, nonprofit for the first 12 months, but we are very founder friendly after that. Happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
No, definitely. So there's been some audience questions that have come in. So you mentioned TRLs.
Yes,
What definition do you follow? Because there are a few different definitions out there.
absolutely. If you have an idea and a technical publication, you're too early for us. We want the inventor to know at least one use case and have a bench scale prototype which is ready. So that's TRL3. We follow the DOE published definitions of technology readiness levels. So 3 to 5 is the right way to engage with us because that puts you in a perfect sweet spot for us to accelerate your pilot scale journey within 12 months.
No, definitely. And I think you went into this a little bit farther, but you don't require your technologies to be a startup to enter the program, correct?
Absolutely not. We are working with a few PIs, but we have helped them incorporate their companies. We've also helped them find their co-founders, which have been operators in larger companies and now are looking for their venture moves. So really tying them with a very business smart person, because they're brilliant scientists, they're potentially first-time entrepreneurs, and you need a CEO or a business mind to wrap a business model around the great technology which is being developed. So we do company formation, we do founder matching, but yes, that's a process that we support, and we also support the process monetarily through the grant funding that we award.
And there were some questions on your entrepreneur in residence program. So I know it's newer, but if you could talk a little bit more into that. And then also everybody always wants to know money questions. So if you could talk about how those are paid.
Money, I yes, love speaking about that aspect. But let's target the entrepreneurs in residence first, right? So this is literally something that we discuss all the time with our partners as well, is that we don't want to make a brilliant scientist into a mediocre entrepreneur or a brilliant tech transfer office into a mediocre investor. We want to be collaborative in our process of developing technologies that really matter and have a landing place in the market, right? So what our entrepreneurs in residence do, we currently work with 4 of them, and they come from really great backgrounds. One of them comes from BP, one of them has spent decades at Chevron, one of them has worked with venture capital funds and financial model development and business models. And fourth is very specific to geothermal. He's a PhD geothermal and consults with some of the largest companies out there. So all 4 of you see bring in very different expertise. Some of them, they bring very different expertise, and what they actually help our founders, technical founders, do is start thinking through how to engage with customers. Second is connect with the right set of investors, because there's no spray and pray approach when it comes to venture capital financing. You need to know which investors are potentially interested in your technology. Third, but not, and this is something that I think Tom mentioned before, was that, hey, there can be 80-page technical publications, but you can't consume those. Your customers can't consume those. And you want to translate that into a pitch that really resonates and expresses the value proposition that you have. And most of our EIRs spend a lot of time helping articulate the technology and value proposition for these founders. All of our EIRs can engage with the founders for up to 20 hours a week, and that cost is entirely covered by us. So Jaimie, we just started this program, but the reception has been incredible, and we are looking to expand this further for our next 15 startups, which are coming on board very soon. As to your second question in terms of funding, as I mentioned, Rosedrop Bridge is set up as a 501 nonprofit. We do give $100,000 of non-dilutive grant funding upfront. We also give $50,000 of non-cash, support in terms of business concierge services, and that does not include the EIR program, which is also a value addition that our startup founders get. Over and above that, if your pilot is successful, and this conversation potentially starts in the 12 months that we're engaging with these technologies, right? Because we are developing internal advocacy for these technologies within this really large energy corporations. So if the technology is bound to work, we will come in and put in the first investment through our in-house $50 million venture fund. These investments typically will be in the size of $250,000 to $3 million, depending upon how good the technology is, what is the capital intensity of that particular technology. Our corporate venture arms also are known to directly put in small checks and also become customers of that technology and product if it really does well in the piloting stage that we kind of line up within 12 months. So that's how the capital structure for us works. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. So we are coming a bit on time. We're going to have our panelists stay a little extra 15 minutes to go through some questions. But if you do need to go off to your next meeting, when you exit the webinar, there will be a survey that will be sent. Please fill out that survey. We really do look at those results and tailor our webinars based on those results. But in the meantime, we're going to go to some Q&A. First off, I'm going to start with a quick round robin on one question. And this is going to just sort of the general knowledge of Venture Studio. So how does your Venture Studio differ from other models that help startups? And an example for this could be accelerators or incubators. So I'm going to start with Tom.
Yeah, I mean, very simply, the biggest difference is that we are building the startup. So we are putting in the operating team, seed funding it, and then off to the races. So, and then we are, literally invested in that company until it either fails or gets acquired, hopefully acquired before it fails. But anyway, so that's the biggest difference. I mean, accelerators and incubators, accelerators are defined, number of weeks and number of startups that exist and help with all kinds of things and scaling their business and such. And an incubator is just that. It's kind of a co-working space with lots of bells and whistles. But yeah, biggest difference is we put in the operating team.
Thank you. Taylor, do you have anything to add to that? Oh, you're muted.
I echo what Tom said. I think that's one of the benefits of the studio is that it's more than, for universities, it's more than just a licensee. There were always resources and services that I wished the startups that we licensed to had. And so that's why we created the studio, was because we saw those needs that university startups had and there were gaps. And so with our services, we try and fill all of those gaps.
And Prutha.
Yeah, I think venture studios typically associated with generating new ideas and developing them into technologies, and that's how they own equity in the companies. I think one thing that Rosedog Bridge does different is building technology with the customer in loop. So there's always a landing place. We don't believe in building technologies just because you can, but because we know that there's a validated need for it out there.
No, definitely. And I think you all did a great job talking about what technologies you're looking for. But on the other hand, what technologies wouldn't prosper in your model? So I'm going to start with you, Prutha, and we'll go round robin back around.
That's a great question because you never generally think about these. But when I look back at the success cases or successful commercial outcomes that we've able to create for our startups, it's because of the intelligence that we have or the insights we have from a partner consortium. So somebody put in the chat window, what about life sciences? Unfortunately, we do not have life science partners, nor do we have assets on which we can pilot out life science technologies, right? So I think the technologies which are not directly adjacent to our strategic areas of interest, we potentially will not be able to create the level of commercial outcomes we are able to otherwise, right? So we are very focused, we are very thematic, and we want to keep doing that because we know that's the way we are going to make movement on some of the most complex energy problems out there.
Perfect. And then we'll go to Tom.
So if I understood correctly, so we're talking about things that would not work well. Okay. So when I think about, particularly in life sciences, so a couple of things in particular, if something is an incremental improvement over what is already in market, we're not interested. If it, as an example, if it's a repurposed drug, that is something that we're definitely not interested in. Also, just from my experience, we've tried to work with startups that have, a CEO, that have a cap table and so on, and trying to bolt ourselves onto that startup, and inevitably it doesn't work because we're disrupting their sort of current structure. With one caveat, I know there are a number of PIs that create a startup simply to go out and get certain types of grants, whether it's SBIR, STTR type grants, which is great. We love that. But they fully understand and appreciate that they need, operators to run their company. Others, I will say, we've had a number of experiences where, I think every VC, every venture studio has their sort of bad experiences, if you will. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I see and a problem that we encounter is, we're talking about innovations, we're talking about technology and so on and so forth, but ultimately it's about the people. And on occasion, we will bump into a PI that, for whatever reason, we just can't work with. And as much as we try to put them through quote unquote conversion therapy, it doesn't necessarily work. So we've had some negative experiences in that way. So I think upfront, just understanding the PI's level of acceptance and humility in that, there are others out there that have experience and expertise in operating startups and sort of the acceptance of that. But I don't know if that fully answers your question, but, we've all had our bumps and bruises along the way, I'm sure. But again, going back to original question, if it's an incremental improvement, not interested. We're looking at something that is novel, new, big change, big opportunities. Yeah.
And then Taylor.
Yeah, certainly. Tom, I don't know what you're talking about, bumps and bruises in tech transfer at universities. Like, I don't know where you're coming from, but that's never happened. And it seems like it's a constant bump and bruise. But it's an awesome space and we love it. I think just adding on maybe to what Prutha and Tom said, we're looking for something maybe about a TRL 7 or further. Like, we're not well suited to do that earlier stage like Prutha is. We're wanting to see at least a prototype or at least a working model. We don't want to have to create something from a plain idea. That's what we're expecting the PI and their research funds to do. Again, we're only looking at software, so we're not well suited to take on hardware risk. If there is a hardware software combination, the hardware needs to be more off the shelf. Like, if we're developing software for an MRI machine, that makes sense because we don't have to create the MRI machine. And then lastly, we're also not well suited or experienced enough in the regulated software in healthcare. Like, we do have some software that has gone through nominal regulatory paths with the FDA, but beyond 510K, it's not where we're working.
Perfect. So I'm going to ask one more question and we'll go around. And then after that, the contact information, because there have been so many great questions that have come in and we've tried our best to answer all of them, but everyone's contact information is on this slide. So please feel free to reach out to any of us afterwards with any of your questions. But the last question I'm going to leave you guys today, because most of our audience is those at University Tech Transfer, university researchers. Can you share any best practices you've learned about how universities can work with venture studios? And I'll start with Prutha.
Sure. My first job was actually at Dartmouth's tech transfer office in the US. So very familiar with the process internally. But what really helps, right, is let's lower the barrier to at least getting exclusive options to the technology, because nobody's going to commercialize it until, it takes a long time to get tough technologies to market. But options help you engage with more stakeholders. And that's kind of a key to get more industry engagement. And second is that we do prioritize search at tech transfer offices. What industry wants to look at is freedom to operate. So can we also kind of include that in shareables with your PIs so that PIs can educate their potential industry partners and future investors about their freedom to operate? And we don't spend a lengthy cycle engaging, law firms externally to kind of do that process. So these two, I think, are very low lift and really make a difference when you want to commercialize technologies and bring things out of labs. So those would be my two. Thank you.
Well, that's great. So Tyler, I'll go with you next, since you were also at a tech transfer office.
Yeah. So having been on both sides of the table, I think setting expectations early and being able to be just open and sharing in terms of what the technology actually is and kind of state of the union currently, and then also in terms of the terms of the agreements, even just sharing a somewhat standardized term sheet so that if it's the first time that you've worked together, that's a good way to short circuit difficulties along the path. So setting those expectations, just high level of communication, has been most helpful for us.
Perfect. And then Tom.
Yeah, I don't know how much I could add to what's already been said. I mean, the idea of an exclusive option, I mean, that's fantastic that Prutha had mentioned. And, starting with sort of a standard term sheet or terms, if you will. I would say too, just one thing for all tech transfer offices to keep in mind is that really our business model is based upon success. So it works best for all when we are all successful. And in other words, we're mission aligned. So we're, again, as I said before, and all of us here on the call are literally invested in these new companies. And it's in our best interest to get them to an exit as quickly and efficiently as possible. And inevitably that means, revenue and milestone payments and such for the university. So I think understanding that mission alignment is super critical. Yeah, I think that's it.
No, and I think that is a great way to end the webinar, actually, that we're all mission aligned on trying to help these university technologies cross that valley of death. So I want to thank our panelists today. This has been an excellent discussion, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time to talk about your venture studios, but also to help share your expertise in this space. And like I said, everyone's contact information is at this slide. The webinar was recorded. You can share it with your fellow tech transfer or university researchers who were not present today. And we do, when you leave the webinar, we do have a survey. So please fill that out. We really do look at these surveys and help tear ideas like this about venture studios from those surveys. So I just want to thank everyone for staying a few extra minutes today, and we really appreciate your time.